Welcome back, Harry. We are looking today at the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 5. This section, chapters 4 to 8, this is really the most famous part of this part of Matthew. Is there an overall theme to the Sermon on the Mount, would you say?
There are a couple of ways in which you can think about the themes of the Sermon on the Mount. It is, as you say, a kind of basic classical text of Christianity in all sorts of ways. And lots of people, when they think about the distinctive teaching of Jesus, go right to the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew begins with some Beatitudes, and I want to talk a little bit about what they are, and then has Jesus say something about his relationship with Torah, that he came to fulfill, not abolish Torah. This ties in with what we talked about last time, the kind of emphasis on continuity with the religion of Israel. That's a very important part of the Gospel of Matthew. So, yeah, continuity with Torah, I think, is a very important issue. And then a couple of other things that Jesus points to are the ways in which one should conduct one's pious practices, and then a lot of practical wisdom. So it's, if you will, a kind of combination of Torah and wisdom, two major elements of the Jewish tradition, in a kind of focused form. So if there's one theme that ties it all together, it's something that we hear at the end of this chapter 5, that you should be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect. So what is it to be perfect? I think that's sort of the heart of the whole thing.
Do you want to address that question? What is it to be perfect?
What is it to be perfect?
Impossible.
Indeed, yeah.
Ideal?
I mean, there are some various ways in which that could be understood. In some ways, this is Jesus being put in dialogue with part of the Torah, Leviticus 19, the Holiness Code, which concludes with a similar kind of pithy little statement that be ye holy as I am holy. So one notion of perfection has to do with holiness. And I think what Jesus is, in Matthew's view, calling for is a holiness that it stands in continuity with the holiness that's called for in Torah. And that holiness exhibits itself in many ways. It exhibits itself in behavior, it exhibits itself in pious practices, it exhibits itself in a fundamental principle, the Golden Rule, which is articulated in the heart of this discourse too, and Jesus frames it in positive terms, in everything do to others as you would have them do to you. This is in chapter 7, verse 12, for this is the law and the prophets. So perfection in some ways is summarizing the fundamental principle that's at the heart of the whole biblical tradition, and that's the way Jesus does it. What he's doing there in that articulation of a fundamental principle is analogous to what goes on in rabbinic circles. And this is something that is an important part of Matthew, saying that what we're doing as followers of Jesus is not incompatible with the best of Judaism. I think that's a very important part of his whole apologetic and theological program. So we have stories, for instance, about rabbis who articulate this same very principle in slightly different ways, or who also try to summarize the law and the prophets in some pithy way. So I think Jesus is being portrayed as someone who is very much in a rabbinical, if you will, Pharisaic mode, who is in touch with God's revelation on Mount Sinai and with the whole tradition of wisdom reflection that flowed from that, and summarizing it and bringing it together in an important way. So I think that's what's involved with perfection.
Yeah. It's interesting because this is different, right, from the version in Luke. Luke doesn't say, be perfect as my Father in heaven is perfect. He says, be merciful. So that's one difference between Matthew's version of this sermon and Luke's. Are there others that you think are particularly important?
Yeah, Luke has a version of this teaching, the sermon that he frames as the Sermon on the Plain.
Right.
And it's shorter. It has some elements that run parallel to what we have in the Sermon on the Mount. But there are some teachings of Jesus that Matthew includes here that Luke has someplace else. For instance, the Lord's Prayer does not appear as part of the great sermon in Luke. The emphasis on mercy in Luke is certainly tied in with an important theme in Luke, mercy and forgiveness, which is what God does for us and which is what we are supposed to do for others. That's not absent in Matthew, but it's not made the dominant theme. So I think Matthew's concern, as we've said before, is to show Jesus in some ways as compatible with and continuing the tradition of Torah observance. And hence all of these plays on motifs that are common in rabbinic circles in particular. To take another example of the difference between Matthew and Luke, think about the Beatitudes, right? In the Beatitudes, you have a longer text. This is in Matthew 5, verses 3 through 11. Luke has a shorter version, but he also has a set of woes. And so Beatitudes and woes function in Luke as a kind of prophetic discourse, right? And that may be closer to the way in which Jesus used these in the first place. Matthew sees them more as teaching tools. And we find examples of both forms of Beatitudes in the Old Testament. Happy the man who has a good wife. Nothing you can do about that. You get a good wife, you're lucky, right? Or happy the man who abides by Torah. Well, you can do something about that. And I think Matthew's are more in the latter mode. That is, they're ways of inculcating certain kinds of virtues or attitudes. So whereas Luke says, blessed are the poor, and he talks about the real poor, why are they blessed? Because they're going to get their reward in the end. Matthew says, blessed are the poor in spirit. That's something you can do something about. You can have an attitude that's detached from worldly goods, and I think that's one of the things that Matthew wants to inculcate. So all of these Beatitudes have a kind of didactic function in Matthew. They don't, one little point of difference.
I have another question about that blessed are the poor versus blessed are the poor in spirit. Do you think that connects to Matthew's actual audience? I know some have read it that way, that actually Matthew is expanding the applicability beyond just poor Christians to more established, well-to-do.
Right. Well, this is a big issue in the development of early Christianity. What should be one's attitude toward worldly possessions? And there were some who took the advice that is put on the lips of Jesus to go sell all and give to the poor and live a life of real poverty. And we know that there was a strand in ancient Judaism that viewed the pious as the poor, and so there's continuity there. But by the 2nd century, you have people who are not quite willing to do that, and so see poverty as a matter of interior attitude rather than exterior practice. And so it may be that Matthew is closer to that end of things. That attitude you get in people like Clement of Alexandria late in the 2nd century, but it's already there earlier on, I think.
Another question I have is, you've emphasized, and I think rightly, the continuity between Jesus' teachings here and the Old Testament. But there are also some discontinuities, right? Do you want to say something about those?
Yeah, well, the first section of the Sermon on the Mount after the Beatitudes is something called the antithesis, where it says, you've heard of old, but I'm going to tell you, right? And initially, that seems to be a kind of rejection or denigration of Torah or the teachings of the Old Testament, in spite of what Jesus says in chapter 5, verses 17 and following, don't think that I've come to abolish the law, I've come to fulfill it, right? But as soon as you probe a little bit into these antitheses, say chapter 5, verse 21, you've heard it said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or a sister, you'll be liable to judgment and nasty things. If you think about that for a minute, it's not abrogating the old, it's reinforcing it. Intensifying it. And in fact, in Jewish circles, in something called Pirkei Avot, which is a tractate of the Mishnah, you have it said as an ideal that what a rabbi should do is to build a fence around Torah. That is to make conditions such that you'll never come close to violating the fundamental commandments of Torah. And that, in effect, is what Jesus is largely doing or portrayed as doing here in Matthew 5. And this ties in, it's another element of the perfection theme, the notion that righteousness needs to be better than that of the scribes and the Pharisees, This is what Jesus is portrayed as saying in chapter 5, verse 20. And how can that be? If you're extending and reinforcing fundamental principles of Torah in such a way as never to abrogate Torah, then your righteousness will exceed the scribes and the Pharisees. And, by the way, you'll be perfect.
Right.
Or you'll be aiming at perfection. Yeah. So I think that's what's going on here. It's not rejection of Torah. Think about some of the other ones. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That's there in the Pentateuch, all right. And Jesus says, turn the other cheek. And if you turn the other cheek, you'll never be in danger of missing the eye or taking an action that will be in contradiction to even more fundamental principles. So there are judgments being made about how exactly to negotiate the ethical life, but the fundamental framework here is one of reinforcing fundamental principles of Torah.
Okay. One more I think we could look at is the injunctions about divorce, Matthew 5:31 to 32. What do you make of this, and what do you think in light of the fact that many Christian denominations don't abide by this rule today?
Yeah, it's interesting. People worry about how many of these sayings that are attributed to Jesus in the Gospels actually go back to things that he said. And I think that there's a pretty broad consensus among scholars of all different stripes that if there's one thing that we can be absolutely sure that Jesus said was no divorce, right? It's attested in all sorts of early Christian sources, and it's attested in Paul in 1 Corinthians 7. So I think we can be pretty certain that Jesus, for whatever reason, maybe to protect women, maybe to do something like put a fence around Torah, to protect marriage, whatever, he had a prohibition on divorce. But everybody who transmits that saying of Jesus wrestles with it, even in these early stages. Yeah. Paul says in 1 Corinthians, look, I know what Jesus says, but I'm going to give you an exception. Right. And that has been enshrined in Roman Catholic tradition as the Pauline privilege. So even in a tradition that's very much anti-divorce, you have a case that's allowed because it's allowed in Scripture. Here, I think Matthew has an exception clause, both here and in chapter 19, where he has another reference to the anti-divorce saying of Jesus. He has an exception clause that we don't have in Mark or in Luke. That is, except in cases of usually translated sexual immorality. There's debate about exactly what he meant by that, but the most ordinary interpretation is that the wife has been misbehaving, and in those cases you can divorce her. That sounds as if Matthew is doing the same kind of thing that Paul is doing in 1 Corinthians. That is saying, I know what Jesus said, but gee whiz, we can't live with that literally. We have to interpret it and apply it in Matthew's sense in a legal fashion. So the fact that early Christians wrestle with this, I think, is something that is indicative of what has to happen in all of the tradition. There are lots of things that Jesus says that are very provocative, and we could call them sometimes hyperbolic, cut off the hand that offends you and that kind of stuff. We'll talk about some of those sayings a little later on. They're meant to stimulate some serious reflection about where your priorities are. Are they meant to be followed literally in every case? Well, our early Christian witness suggests that no, people have had to live with and to try to apply them, to wrestle with them.
Yeah. So if we are to sum up the Sermon on the Mount, how would you do that? Would you go back to the idea of that wholeness, perfection, holiness? Is that...
Yeah, it's interesting to think about a big, complex collection of teaching like this in different ways. And I think thinking of it as an ellipse with two foci might be a good way to do it. One would be the focus on perfection, whatever that means, having your righteousness be as stringent as possible. And on the other side, doing to others as you would have them do unto you, the golden rule. These, I think, are two important foci. In some ways, they're perhaps combined in the Lord's Prayer, and which is right at the central portion of this whole thing. Another way of thinking about the Sermon on the Mount is in terms of its overall structure, and there is a kind of ring composition or chiastic structure to it, and it focuses where? On the Lord's Prayer. So pray as Jesus did, and you'll live as Jesus wanted you to live, in conformity with Torah, doing unto others as you would have them do unto you, and that's it.
And that will come back around later in the
It will
gospel
indeed.
as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.